Hello, my name is Roger Bachmann. I've been a professional limnologist throughout my career, and the last 17 years I've been down here with Florida LAKEWATCH doing research, trying to understand how Florida lakes function and how we might best manage them. Today I'm giving a talk in the Florida LAKEWATCH chat series that Dr. Canfield invited me to participate in. I'm going to talk about the proposed nutrient criteria for the state of Florida, and I'm going to start out with a little background. 40 years ago in Florida, we had a number of lakes where we had severe point source pollution. We didn't treat them well, and Florida is not the only place. There are other places that have done that as well. And this is essentially pollution that's coming in on a pipe, untreated sewage or partially treated sewage, and some places the waste from citrus packing plants and so on. And these added nutrients to the water, and we refer to this as cultural eutrophication. And if we increase the input of nutrients to a lake, the concentrations of nutrients in the lake go up, and consequently we get changes in the lake itself. And I want to emphasize that we're talking about a change from the natural state. This is the real problem. And sometimes what happens is that we get a great increase in biological productivity, and we may have more algae there than we had before. Limnologists recognize that lakes have different degrees of productivity, and they originally gave them names, or two names, and those lakes that had low biological productivity were called the oligotrophic lakes, and then the very productive ones were called eutrophic lakes. And then the way these things go, well, you get a bunch in the middle, you don't know where they are, so they call them mesotrophic. And in Florida, we have a broad distribution of what we call the trophic states. Well, point source pollution is no longer a real problem in Florida. We have strict laws that came in with the Clean Water Act, a permitting process and so on, and we've pretty well cleared it up. It is illegal for most kinds of point source pollution. And so what we're really dealing with now is non-point source pollution. This is where we have more diffuse sources, runoff from the land. We can't really identify a particular source where the nitrogen or phosphorus is coming from. And this makes it a little more elusive to deal with. We can't just make measurements on the end of a pipe. Well, the United States Environmental Protection Agency has now published the numeric nutrient criteria for Florida lakes. And you can really sum up the major component of this law that says that really that any lake that has enough nitrogen or phosphorus present in the water support an algal population that creates a chlorophyll concentration of 2 micrograms per liter or more is considered to be in violation of the nutrient criteria. And so we go back to our distribution here, and I drew the 20 microgram per liter line there, and so those lakes on the right side. I should point out on the bottom, this is a logarithmic scale, and so we go from 1 to 10 to 100. Otherwise, we get a curve that's kind of stretched out. So here it looks like about a quarter of the lakes right off the back are going to be considered impaired for nutrients. The underlying assumption here is that prior to European settlement, there weren't any eutrophic lakes in Florida. In other words, that all of the modern eutrophic lakes are there because we have polluted them with non-point source pollution. And this is an assumption that we have looked at, and we have several different ways and have tested this using all of the available data. So what do we know about Florida lakes? Well, one of the wonderful things about Florida LAKEWATCH is that we have people sampling lakes all across the state, and represented by the dots here. Most of the lakes here in the sample are from Florida LAKEWATCH. You notice that they're not randomly distributed, and that's because lakes are not randomly distributed across the state either. There are certain areas we have big concentrations, other areas that don't have any lakes at all. If we look at the distribution of phosphorus and nitrogen and chlorophyll, like for example, on the top graph here, this is just the frequency distribution of total phosphorus. And again, notice the big range of the lower lakes are down about 3 or 4 micrograms per liter, and the way in the far end we have some lakes that have more than 1,000, so we're over 3 orders of magnitude. This is a big change. And the same is true for nitrogen and for chlorophyll. We found that this is not random. We can group lakes into lake regions, and we can put together similar lake regions and come up with nutrient zones. And the real dark blue these are lakes of practically rainwater. They have very little phosphorus in. The median there's 4, and then they go up roughly doubling for each as we go from zone to zone. And the same is true for nitrogen, and they roughly follow the very similar boundaries. And if we do statistical tests where we have a little box plot showing the median value and the 25% values and so on the upper curve there we have total phosphorus. And for these 6 phosphorus zones, they are populations of lakes that are significantly different from each other. And we can do the same with nitrogen. Here we can do it with 5 nitrogen zones. And so if we're looking at the source of variability in nutrients and chlorophyll in Florida lakes, and here we have a range within the state of Florida that's comparable to all of the lakes in the United States, from the most productive to the least productive. And it really goes back to the fact that Florida has a very complex geology. And here's a geologic map. And in particular, in Florida, we have deposits of phosphatic rocks. And in fact, we mine it commercially in Florida. 75% of all of the phosphorus that is mined in the United States comes from the state of Florida. And you kind of look at the patterns here, these black things. There's down there by south of Tampa, there's a big black blob, and then we have some lines that work up toward the central part of the peninsula. And then here's from a study of the Geologic Survey looking at phosphorus in the sediments of very small streams, which represent the bedrock materials, and we see the same pattern. And we come back to our lake pattern. The reds and the oranges are the real high phosphorus lakes, and they follow the same thing too. And so we have a relationship between the geology of Florida and the concentrations of total phosphorus and total nitrogen in Florida lakes. So this is evidence that natural factors may be playing a major role in determining where the eutrophic lakes are found. Well, we used 3 different scientific tests to test this idea that anthropogenetic factors, in other words, human effects, are responsible for the presence of eutrophic lakes in Florida. And the first one is the reference lake approach, and it kind of makes some sort of sense. We'd like to know what the nutrient concentrations are in Florida lakes that really don't have any human development around them. And this is one that U.S. EPA put out a few years ago. And these presumably would represent lakes that the other lakes would be like if they didn't have any development. Well, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection has put together a similar group of lakes. They call them benchmark lakes. There are 30 of them. These were lakes that they carefully selected for having little or no human disturbance. And then they went in and looked at the biology, and they found these were in good biological condition. So, and actually they did this to set criteria for Florida's lakes. It was the original idea. And in theory, you might expect something like this. We're down on the bottom, we have this normal curve showing the distribution of phosphorus, and we would have the reference lakes. And then if all the other lakes have various degrees of pollution, we would expect another normal curve, but it's shifted over to the right. And the difference between the two means there would tell us how much we had. Well, when we looked at the data that we had and compared the non-benchmark lakes, which is essentially all of the lakes, with the benchmark lakes, which are essentially the reference lake, there is no statistical difference between them. And this was a big surprise. Most Florida lakes are no different in their nutrient concentrations from the benchmark lakes, which have little human disturbance. And of course, we're not talking about those few that have had major point source pollution. We're talking about all the rest of them. And so we don't see a big impact. Secondly, we can look at correlations between land use and nutrient concentrations. The Florida DEP has commissioned work which developed what they call the Landscape Development Intensity Index. They work with maps and GIS systems. They look at the different kinds of land uses in the watershed immediately around the lakes and what percent area are involved in these. And then they have a series of coefficients, and I'll just show a few of them. They go from those with natural systems, and they have a coefficient of 1, and so presumably these are ones that don't have any impact at all, and then go through a graded series of land uses where you expect more effect, and so you get at the highest ones we have commercial districts and business districts. In between we have residential and a whole different range of agricultural types, many more than are shown here. And so we come up with an LDI value for the lake, which tells us how much human activity we have that might do it. If you look in the upper left, the horizontal scale on the bottom there is this LDI index. The far left would be essentially no real development, and to the right it would go progressively higher. And here in the upper left, that's total phosphorus, and it's a complete shotgun. There's no relationship at all. And you go to the right, this is the Kildall nitrogen, the form of nitrogen you find in lakes, no relationship. The middle one on the left is chlorophyll. The next one on the right is secudip, and so on. None of these measures of trophic lakes show any correlation at all with development. Again, which is a big surprise. So the conclusion is that in general, Florida lakes with intensive land uses in their immediate watersheds are no different from lakes with minimal human activities in their immediate watersheds. And so seemingly natural factors are more important in determining trophic state than human activities. And sure, there are some things that are going to do that are going to contribute some nutrients, but if we're talking significance, is it really making a change that we can measure in the lakes, and we don't see it. Lastly, the use of paleolimnological data to determine past conditions. That's a big word, paleolimnological, but it's really kind of simple. One kind of single-cell plant that grows in lakes are called diatoms, and they're very interesting because they make these little glass cases that surround them with very elaborate decorations on them, which makes them very handy to identify them. And there's thousands of different kinds. And each species of diatom has a particular set of environmental conditions that it prefers. For example, they might prefer a certain concentration of phosphorus or a certain concentration of nitrogen or pH, what have you. So the diatoms that are growing in the lake reflect the chemical conditions, and when they die and they settle out into the sediments, they preserve a record of the chemical conditions. And so one technique is to go out and make what we call short cores in the lake and look at the diatoms that are found at the top of the core and those that are found in the bottom. And usually the bottom, we're going back in Florida, say going back into the 1800s sometime, which represents essentially pre-disturbance and modern things. And we have data from 32 cores reported by Mark Brenner and Tom Whitmore of the University of Florida, 9 more from US EPA as a part of their National Lake Assessment. If we take the difference between the top and the bottom, And if we look at the top graph, there's a horizontal line that says 0. This would be no difference. If the bars go up, it means that it increased. The bars go down, it means that the top had less than the bottom. But there's a certain amount of error involved in making this inference from the diatoms, and so we've calculated the 95% confidence limits, which is a standard in science. And so only the bars that go beyond that grayed area are statistically significant. And so now we find that from these 42 lakes, we have 6 that have shown an increase. And we've gone back and looked individually at each of these lakes, and each one of these lakes has a point source of pollution, so it is not non-point source. And if we look at the bottom of these things, the cores, we find that 66% of them have 30 micrograms of phosphorus or more, and these would be eutrophic lakes. So we have a lot of them. So the paleolimnological studies show that we don't have significant increases in total phosphorus in Florida lakes due to recent non-point source pollution, and that the paleolimnology indicate that many Florida lakes have always had high levels of total phosphorus in their waters and are eutrophic naturally. So our two assumptions that are the basis for the EPA regulations have been disproved. They really do not hold. So that the proposed numeric nutrient criteria for Florida lakes will wrongly designate several naturally eutrophic lakes as being impaired, and a lot of resources will be wasted trying to reduce the nutrient concentrations in those lakes. Currently, the use designation of Florida lakes is recreation, propagation, and maintenance of a healthy, well-balanced population of fish and wildlife. Well, phosphorus and nitrogen are essential elements for living organisms. These are not toxic. And in fact, across a group of lakes, the more nutrients you have, the higher your biological productivity. We've done studies in Florida looking at the fish populations. As phosphorus goes up, the populations of fish go up, including those of the major sport species. The best fishing lakes in Florida, as determined by the biologist of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, all have concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen which are greater than those of the average of all lakes in Florida. And so for fish, the more nutrients, the more fish, and the better the fishing. Aquatic birds, which of course feed on fish, like better productivity. As the phosphorus goes up in lakes, we see higher populations of aquatic birds in those lakes. There's another study that looked at alligators and found the same things. Lastly, one thing that doesn't, we have lakes that are filled with aquatic macrophytes. We consider these weed problems. Sometimes this is blamed on the nutrients, but actually a big study we did looking at the density of these macrophytes found that there was really no correlation with phosphorus, except at the very highest levels on the right when we didn't have any at all. They get their nutrients from the sediments and not the water. For some people, the flora and fauna of eutrophic lakes are not appealing. They consider these communities of eutrophic lakes to be unhealthy. But from a biologist standpoint, over the course of millions of years of evolution, we have various species that evolved naturally to live in lakes ranging from oligotrophic to eutrophic. There is no absolute standard that says that one type of natural biological community is healthy and another is unhealthy because of the nutrient concentrations. Our thought is that we should go back and recognize the variability in Florida lakes in setting nutrient standards. And so, for example, we could take each zone and each of the 6 phosphorus zones, look at the top 10% of those lakes as potentially being impaired, and then going out and setting up investigations to look and say, okay, do we actually have pollution here that needs to be controlled? And only if we can document that, then we would go in and do all of the regulatory things that are involved for a lake that is declared as impaired. For the rest of the lakes, we could say we have an anti-degradation clause in the state statutes that say you can't put things that make a lake worse than it is now. And so essentially we would look at the current situation of the lakes and say, okay, we won't allow for increases beyond that. This proposal takes into account natural variability of Florida lakes. It would set standards for most lakes immediately. It would make wise use of regulatory resources by concentrating in the lakes most likely to have anthropogenic nutrient enhancement. So in conclusion, the proposed numeric nutrient criteria for Florida lakes will wrongly designate several natural eutrophic lakes as impaired. A lot of resources will be wasted in trying to reduce the nutrient concentrations in such lakes. And in our opinion, it would be better to investigate the smaller number of lakes that might be subject to nutrient pollution and apply the law if there's a documented evidence that they have changed due to human activities. Thank you for your attention.